Thank you, Linda Hahn, and thank you everybody for showing up tonight. I'm really surprised that so many people came, and I'm honored by that. I want to say a few things about the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. And one thing is a question, who started the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers? Well, it turns out that there were various astronomical societies started in San Francisco before the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. One of them, by among all people, Herman Fast. Herman Fast was a longtime member of this club, and many people have memories of him. I don't know about anymore, but they did for a while. And also the president of the American Can Company started an astronomical society. You remember the American Can Company out on 3rd Street? They're going towards the bridge. At any rate, all those societies that got started depended upon the generosity and the enthusiasm and the charisma of one person. And when that happens, when that one person runs out of energy or time or whatnot, that's the end of the society. And so there was no permanent astronomical society in San Francisco until this society was organized by Betty Neal and Captain, geez, I panic when I can't see. The shop, who's the shop named after? Wallace, Captain Wallace. They came from they came over here from both of them were in the East Bay Astronomical Society, which had been going for many years, maybe into the 1920s. And they came over here and organized an astronomical society and got it running.
You want me to go to the Betty Neal slide?
What?
Betty Neal slide?
Wait just a second, until I get to Betty Neal. Okay. Betty Neal, I guess, okay, let's get the Betty Neal slide.
Well, remember, we have that other one first. This one.
We'll skip that one for now and come back to it.
Are you going to come back to it? Promise?
Well, okay, maybe I should say.
All right,
okay.
say a word.
Okay, I'll say a word. Again, this is a little bit about me and the Astronomical Society, but eventually became, and I credit the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers for this because I didn't study astronomy in high school. I didn't study astronomy in college, except for one course that I took in practical astronomy. But nevertheless, I more or less single-handedly created this particular telescope. And if anything, my education is to be credited, it's the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers where I learned about astronomy. That was my college. This was my college, upstairs in that very room that we're going to go to next month. And it happened that in the, I guess it was the late 50s or early 60s, NASA put out a request for proposal for a space telescope. This was in the days, in Saturn days, and of course, in those days, everyone supposed that the Saturn rocket would be the one that would carry the first large telescope into space. As you all know, it didn't work out that way, but that was what everybody thought would happen. And the Saturn rocket was capable of carrying a monolithic 150-inch mirror telescope into space. And the company that I worked for decided to make a proposal for that and for other things too. And that was the Chrysler Corporation in New Orleans, Louisiana. everybody's always a bit surprised that Chrysler was in the space business. Well, I asked them why, and they said, well, we deal with anything that relates to transportation. Sounds like a dumbass answer like that. But the real reason is this. Werner von Braun had a brother, and the brother was also an engineer, and he was an automotive engineer. Well, when they brought von Braun over to the United States after the war, he said, hey, what about my brother? Said, okay, bring your brother too. What are we going to do with him? Oh, Chrysler Corporation will take him, since he's an automotive engineer. And so that is how come Chrysler got into the space business. And what they did is that they had a large factory that had been used for assembling tanks during the war, World War II, and they used that facility. And they got, Chrysler in a way really didn't make anything. They got the engines here, they got the fuel tanks here, they got the shroud here, they got the control module here. They bolted it all together in a big structure in New Orleans. Nonetheless, Chrysler had an interest in selling more Saturns. They knew that eventually we'd go to the moon, and perhaps people would lose interest in going to the moon, but still like to sell some of these things. And so the space telescope was a reason to sell one more Saturn, maybe two more. Okay, so this I thought, and by that time I learned a bit of astronomy history, and I knew that I knew that the Schmidt telescope, the big Schmidt at Mount Palomar, was built years before the 200-inch, and the official reason was that they wanted a sky survey so that the 200-inch would have a guide as where to go. You know that the field of these big telescopes, like the 200-inch and like the Hubble Space Telescope, is very narrow, and you really can't. You got to know where you're going. But if you're there in the far ultraviolet and in space, you can work in a region of the spectrum where no one else has gone before because you're above the air. You need a survey kind of to say which way to go. And so you need a Schmidt telescope. Only problem is the Schmidt telescope has a lens in the front of it called a correcting plate, and that glass will not transmit ultraviolet. So that kind of spoils the idea of going to space. So the idea is to make a Schmidt telescope that is all mirrors, but NASA didn't think that could be done. But I said it could be done, and here's a telescope that did it. The light comes in the big hole, as it goes in, right there, falls down on a spherical mirror, which all Schmidts have. All Schmidts have a spherical mirror, and it sends the light back up to the correcting plate, and then back down here to the place where the film is. Okay, did I get that right? Okay, I don't think I did. The light comes in here, the correcting plate is here, then the correcting plate sends it to the spherical mirror. The spherical mirror focuses it in the middle, and there's a door to go in and get the film out. This was not intended to be the telescope in space, but it was intended to prove that you could have a Schmidt of that design that would work and take nice pictures. So I was a young kid, kind of enthusiastic and full of myself, and there I am with what I thought of as my telescope, and in a way it was too.
And who's that on the cover?
What?
Who's that on the cover?
Who's that?
On the cover.
That's me, yeah. Yeah, that's me on the cover of Sky and Telescope. Boy, was I proud of that. Tell my brother I'm on the cover of Sky and Telescope. What do you think of that?
You still have that telescope?
No, the telescope is probably fell into the hands of Northwestern University, and it might be in Las Cruces, New Mexico. But that's where that picture is taken. Let's see. Oh, here, I want to show you one more thing in the picture.
There's a little
here.
button on there to push.
Oh,
Yeah,
There we go.
that end. Push the button.
It's just on the side.
The button's on the side.
Yeah.
Little tiny button.
Oh, I found it.
Okay.
Well, there on the side of this telescope is a little elbow telescope. And later on in the talk, I'm going to mention, there were hundreds and hundreds of these around in Army surplus stores. And in those days, everybody and his dog had one. Nice piece of optics for as cheap as it could possibly be. It was called an M17, if you want to Google it. And I'll tell you about those later on.
Okay.
Of course, I was using it just
that
as a
up there.
finder there. Okay,
Okay.
okay.
Tell me when.
Now, enough about me. Let's go back to the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. And there is a lady sitting next to me. That's me there. And that's a lady sitting next to me in her tiger dress, which she frequently wore. And she was a real power. She was a power. My father said she was a pistol. Do you know what a pistol is? In a mortar and pestle, the pestle is, that was a complimentary thing in the days of my father to say somebody was a pestle. And she was, she ran things. She was a rather, not a tall lady, but she was a powerful effect, both in getting the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers going, in setting them up so that they would be self-sustaining and not just go by the charisma of one person, but would elect new officers, new directors, and was capable of self-perpetuation. And she came over from the East Bay in 1952. To come from the East Bay, you had to, get on the key system, come over the bridge. First, you had to get to the key system, and then come up here on a streetcar. Wow! She'd come over here about once every 2 weeks to deal with it. In order to get a picture of who she was and how much energy she put into, the nearest approximation I can think of, if you have to get an actor for her, would be Linda Hahn. Linda Hahn would give you a picture of the kind of person she was. Okay.
Oh, Mahan. I'm
Mahan.
Mahan.
Mahan. Linda Mahan.
I was going to say.
Well,
What's that person?
Yeah.
Oh,
excuse me.
Bless her.
I am. Excuse me.
No, that's good. That's good. I was
Okay.
wondering what person it was.
Thank you for.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. I want to tell you a little bit more about Betty Neal. Betty Neal, her father lived up in Eureka on the coast where the fishing boats and logging goes on, and he was a lawyer there, and he made his living in the following way. On Saturday and Sunday, a lot of the loggers would end up in the calaboose. And come Monday, they would be wanted back on the job. And so it was his job to go and get all the laborers out of jail on Monday and do what papers had to be signed, put up the money. And then the different logging companies had railroads that came down into Eureka, and they would pick up their own people and buy them back for the week, and it was his main way of making a living. But he had a daughter, Betty, and she came down. She went to Stanford University, and to get to Stanford University from Eureka is a long trip. And she'd come down, she'd make that trip maybe twice a month or maybe 3 times a month to visit her family. and you'd come down on the Northwestern Pacific Railroad, all the way from Eureka, maybe to Sausalito. And there you'd get on a ferry boat, and you'd come across to San Francisco on a steam ferry. And then you'd get on a San Francisco streetcar, and it would take you down to 3rd and Townsend Street, where you'd get on a Southern Pacific Railroad steam train that would take you down to Palo Alto. And how she got from Palo Alto to her house, I think the university provided a wagon to pick up the girls so they wouldn't get in any trouble on the way from the railroad station. So that was, and that's quite a thing. The age she lived in was such that she was able to see Halley's Comet twice. Once in 1911 in her father's arms, and then for the last time at the old, not the new, the old Chabot Observatory, which was God knows when, but I'm not going to struggle to find it.
1986?
So yeah, whatever it was, yeah.
What did she study?
75,
Oh, it says right there.
1911 plus 75. When she studied at the University of California, at the University of Stanford, she studied head shrinking. Now everybody and his dog studies psychology when they go to the University of California. You know, they can't get jobs afterwards, but they study psychology. But way back then, when she went to the university, not that many people studied it. It was still a new, far-out thing. But she studied psychology, and when she graduated, she never, ever got a job being a head shrink, which is a real shame, because she would have been a super head shrink. I know, because I knew her, and I knew some head shrinks too, and she could sail around them like a glider. But anyway, that's the story of her life. She became a secretary, and of course, she was lucky to get a job during the Depression, and then when the World War came along after the Depression, labor was valuable, and of course she didn't have a hard time making it after that. I'll tell you another story about Betty Neal at Chabot Observatory. One time in the 1920s, Albert Einstein was visiting the University of California at Berkeley, and he was going to come down to visit the people at Chabot Observatory. And they had tea and cake and cookies and all kinds of things for Albert Einstein, you know, holy cow. Albert Einstein came to see us. Anyway, it was coming down there, and Albert Einstein thought he was going to drive down in a car from the University of California down to the old Chabot Observatory. Well, he started out, an hour went by, 2 hours went by, no Einstein showed up, and there was a big crowd waiting for him. So finally, the crowd wanted to hear something, and Betty Neal said, okay, I'll fill in. I'll have to fill in for Einstein. And so as long as she was filling in for Einstein, they asked her some good questions. And apparently she did halfway well at filling in for Einstein, who incidentally got lost. He was lost someplace between Berkeley and Chabot Observatory. And the story ends that finally he did show up. 3 hours late or something like that. He was persistent, and he got there. But that's the story I like to tell. That Betty Neal filled in for Albert Einstein when he didn't show up. And I could almost see Linda Mahan doing that if worse came to worse, and there was a big crowd. Well, she kept at her job at the Chabot Observatory, coming here and going to star parties until the very end. She lived, I drove her home several times. She lived over there in Oakland near Fruitvale Avenue and East 14th. Not the best neighborhood, but that's where she lived. And finally, when she was walking home, I guess some youths, I think that's the word you're supposed to use, some youths got her and put her in the hospital, and that kind of slowed her down to a full stop eventually. But that's lady played a word not for her. Maybe we would be here, maybe we wouldn't be here. I want to now tell you about another person, the other person, also from the East Bay Astronomical Society, who got us started, and that is a man called Skipper Wallace. Various people have asked why he's called Skipper, but I can't say, but I think it was because he was kind of a leader, and that was just a complimentary name for a leader. He also was a very old man, and he had been a railroad signal engineer, and he had a lot of patents for railroad signals. That was a big thing in those days because in 1952, when we got started, if you wanted to go to Chicago or New York, you got on the ferry boat down at the ferry building, and it wasn't a modern ferry boat, it was a paddle wheel ferry with a steam engine and a walking beam. And you went over to the Oakland Mole, and there you got on a steam train that took you to Sacramento and over to Reno and Salt Lake, Denver, and finally to Chicago and New York. So railroad signaling was a big thing in those days, and he managed to have enough money that on the basis of his patent royalties, he could retire, but not in super comfort. Old Wallace, I visited his house several times. In fact, we used to have meetings there once in a while, and he lived in a basement apartment in Pacific Heights. And I mean a basement apartment. It had, from the window, if you looked out the window, you looked right into the rose bed because it was down at earth level. And he was maybe a yard below that to his floor. And he had 2 rooms down there that he lived in. One room was his kitchen. And in his kitchen, he had his lathe. His lathe was very important, and it was the main thing in the kitchen. And then he had a bedroom of sorts, and there he had his books, and the walls were lined with books, and that was it. That he lived in that. You might even call it a hole in the ground, but that's where Wallace lived. Wallace told a story that when he was a child, he used to play with cards. He had a great number of blue cards, and he made houses with them, and he made geometrical patterns on the floor and whatnot. And when he got a bit older, he realized what those blue cards were. They were unsold tickets to his uncle's, Alfred Russell Wallace's San Francisco lectures. Do you know who Alfred?
Yeah.
He's a guy that perhaps should have gotten the credit that Darwin got, and that was his uncle. And those were the unsold tickets to the lecture that he was playing with. It's a shame, they named a hall up at Sonoma State, Darwin Hall. God knows Darwin has enough honors in the world. They should have named it Wallace Hall because Wallace actually came out to the Bay Area to give a lecture. And Darwin, I don't think, ever came to the United States. So that's the way that goes.
Is there a slide on him?
No.
No, there's
No
no
pictures.
there's no slide. I remember also the first meeting, for what it's worth. Betty Neal and Wallace called a meeting at the San Ramo restaurant, which was a nice Italian family-style restaurant up in North Beach. Now it's a fancy restaurant bar up in North Beach. Okay, so I was there at the first meeting, and with Wallace. I'll say one more thing about, two more things about Wallace. One, he made a telescope. It was equatorially mounted, but it used pipe threads to turn on for both axes. And that became more or less the standard telescope that everyone used. It was like the Dobsonian of its day. And I'll tell you one more thing about him. He wanted the word amateur in the name of the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. A lot of people say, what the hell, let's call it the Royal Society or the San Francisco Society, like the East Bay Astronomical Society. Let's give it a name. He said, no. He said, one of the reasons that I have come over here to San Francisco from the East Bay is because they're too uppity. They think that they are, their lectures are kind of hard to understand, and I want this to be a real amateur society. A little bit like what was in Dobson's mind when he made the sidewalk astronomers, because he thought we were too uppity. But anyway, the history repeats, and that's why we are called the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. And at various times, even now, a proposal occasionally comes up to change it, and I always remember what Dobson said and speak in his favor. And he made the seal for the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers.
Wallace or Dobson?
Wallace.
Wallace.
Wallace
No
made the
kidding.
seal with that telescope on it. And I remember that because there was a contest. And I also submitted a nice seal. But of course, Wallace won, and now, God bless him, he's there, let him stay there. Let him stay there. Okay. The one person had something to do with the organization in the beginning. As I said, they wanted it to be a permanent organization that would run on when these people I talk about are no longer here. And so they needed articles of incorporation. And in those days, it wasn't so easy. The lawyers made a big deal of incorporating you. You couldn't now. I know you can do it as an app on a telephone, I think. But in those days, it was a big deal to incorporate a group. And so it fell to my father to incorporate them, he being a lawyer. And he decided he couldn't do it from scratch, but what he did is he got the Articles of Incorporation of the Jewish Burial Society for indigent Jews who can't afford to bury themselves. And he had that. I guess he was a member of it, or his father was a member of it. And he changed a line here and there, and a word here and there, and that became that became the Articles of Incorporation for the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. Now, enough of these two people. Now I'm through with them, and I'll tell you a little more. The shop got started at that time, and I think it's right beneath us. It's over in that side of the building.
Slightly over there, but yeah.
There was a nice, big optical shop that was started by material that Wallace left. He had a lathe, and everybody was proud of it, but it was a shaky old lathe. It was rattling around, Maybe you could find the center, probably you couldn't. And it wasn't much of a lathe, but it was a lathe, and they had it. And then they had books, beginning with Wallace's books, of course. And then there was an optical shop down in the basement too. A lot of places to grind mirrors, a lot of sinks, a lot of barrels, and a long bench, the optical bench where you could do a knife edge test. And I think the bench was 16 feet long, so you could have a 10-inch f8 mirror in there and test it. You remember that to do a knife edge test, people don't do them much anymore, but if you have a mirror that has a focal length of yay, the distance to the knife edge, when you do the knife edge test, has to be double the focal length of the mirror. And so it takes space, but they made a shop that indeed did have space. And if you wanted to make a telescope, and in those days a lot of people did, that was that was the shop. They called it the Wallace Shop. Okay. About that time, those people passed away from the society. I don't mean that they died, but they had less to do with it. And they had a man called Edward Taylor became the president of the Astronomical Society. And he made his living as a union organizer, but now he was retired and he was an astronomy organizer. And he took over, and he used to go out. Astronomers used to have their own talks for themselves. But Taylor would go out to high schools and grammar schools and bring astronomy to the public. That wasn't such a common thing in those days, that you're going to go out. In fact, it seemed to be a bit evangelical. And you can say that Taylor was the first evangelist type astronomer in San Francisco. My father liked him very much, and I remember he was not a very well-to-do guy. When he was going to give a talk, he'd have to come over to my father and borrow my father's projection equipment and screen and whatnot. But he'd do it, and he'd go out and he would give talks.
Can I ask a question about the shop?
Sure.
So was there one or two people that, before John Dobson came and did his telescope grindings, was there one or two people in the 50s that were kind of leads for
Yes, absolutely. Let me tell you about them.
Tell me.
One of them was Stanley Oliver. Stanley Oliver was a machinist, and he made a living by polishing the valves for Greenberg Fire Hydrant Company. And he was in there. You work for Greenberg?
Well,
What?
great-great-grandfather.
Ah, good. Well, thank God for him. He gave employment to Stanley Oliver, and Stanley Oliver said he's the mechanic from Greenberg, and he's the foreman of the shop. And indeed, he stayed foreman of the shop. Stanley Oliver had a sidekick, and his sidekick's name was Herman Fast, and they stuck around together. Now, you mustn't imagine that they were two love doves, because they always had an argument going. They always had an argument going. And the argument was very often about this. If you know a little bit about Herman Fast, he was a great observer. He had a tiny telescope, maybe 4 inches, and he would go up on Mount Hamilton. He didn't have a car, he'd go up on the bus, and he'd stay up there for 2 days and come back and sleep on the dirt and observe double stars. Walter Scott Houston, I don't know if any of you recall that name, but he was quite a name. He wrote for Sky and Telescope. Walter Scott Houston told me that Herman Fast had seen more double stars than anyone he knew. And Walter Scott used to know a lot of people. Anyway, these two old birds would always be down in the shop. Oliver smoking this pipe, which eventually killed him, and Herman. And what were they arguing about? They were always arguing. Well, they argued about everything, but the main thing they argued about is that Herman had a notebook, and he would write down what double stars he saw and the position angles, make a little sketch of the field of view in the double star, but it was mostly longhand written. And Oliver said, well, that's real old-fashioned. You ought to make photographs of it. And Oliver continuously worked on making his great photographic equatorial. He worked and worked building a fine telescope that would have fine slow motions and could therefore take long time exposures. This was in the day of film, and you realize that film had a quantum efficiency of maybe 0.5%, maybe 1%, but whereas nowadays the CCDs that you use have quantum efficiencies very close to 100. So it was a slow process. But he was making that telescope to track the stars, and his model was a professional telescope with the gears. Of course, one problem was that Oliver would argue back to Stanley, say, well, I know it's nice to have a telescope, but you've been working on that telescope for 5 years now, and it hasn't been out of the shop. So maybe it's better that I just go up and look and write down longhand what I see. So that was the argument between Stanley and Oliver. I always think of them together. Well, there was one other person in the shop, a man called Al Daggett. You guys don't remember Al Daggett, but he was in the shop. He was a very good shop man too. He was a teamster. He was a teamster in the days when teamsters were teamsters and had horses, and he carried pianos up to the flats in San Francisco. But he was a nice machinist, and he did finish a very nice telescope, which he mechanically controlled, slow motions, everything, which he gave to Sonoma State University. I was always kind of disappointed because he would ask me, what's Sonoma State doing with it? I'd go up there frequently. And I hated to tell him, they had it in the closet, that's what they were doing with it. And what happens when you give nice things to people and they just get them for free, it's not the smartest. You think you're going to give something to an institution and they will take care of it and all this and that, and it turns out they're not much better than Joe Blow at using and valuing your stuff. Al Daggett also tells a story about how he helped a whole bunch of kids. They brought a whole bunch of kids into the shop and were making telescopes. And Taylor, I guess, was the man who brought all the kids into the shop. They were all making telescopes for the kids. And pretty soon up to Al Daggett, after Christmas, came one of the kids' mothers and said, blast you, you didn't get my kid's telescope finished in time for Christmas. So a lot of good stuff that you do is not appreciated. You have to be careful about that. In fact, there's nothing much you can do about it, but that's one of the things that discourage people in the shop. Telling you more about the shop, along about that time came John Dobson. John Dobson came down from the mountain. He had not been around San Francisco previously, so he seemed very much a newcomer. and he went into the shop, and of course, John Dobson has a lot of enthusiasm. Oh, yeah, yeah, oh, there's John Dobson. Yeah, and there's Edwina Cherrington. John Dobson had a lot of enthusiasm, and he kind of took over the shop, or at least tried to take over the shop. Well, the old timers that were in the shop didn't appreciate that. Al Daggett didn't, and Herman Fast went along with Oliver, and Oliver surely didn't like that, and so there grew up, to say the least, a bit of difficulty between Dobson and the shop people, and so Dobson shortly thereafter went his own way. They had objections to Dobson too, that he did not make equatorial mounts for his telescope. Now that was a sin, because in those days the amateur astronomers wanted to be like professionals. That was their idea. They would get a meeting and they would give a paper on some technical subject, and they wanted their telescopes to make photographs. And their whole thing is they wanted to publish collections of their papers. The whole thing was that they modeled themselves after professionals. John Dobson saw it a different way. John Dobson let amateurs be amateurs and make telescopes that might not be of the highest quality, but maybe they'll get made, unlike Oliver's telescope that never got made. It was a change in the philosophy of amateur astronomy, and of course in the long run Dobson won the day, but each side had an argument, and the idea of being a little professional became the lost cause, and Dobson became the victor. There he is. There was another thing that Dobson had his own cosmology, which was actually pretty close to the cosmology that Gamow had. Not quite, but for some reason the amateur astronomers felt that they had to follow the code, what was said by the professionals as regards cosmology. It kind of reminds me of arguments that people used to have about the Bible. There was this version of the Bible and that version of the Bible and this, and they would, if you didn't follow it real strict, whoa! And I think that let Dobson have his own cosmology if he wants, so what? He did enough in making that telescope that everybody could make, that equatorial, no, not equatorial, alto-azimuth, that works smooth. That was a wonderful thing. A lot of people had a telescope who would never have one before. But as I say, he didn't do it in the SFAA telescope shop. He went his own way. Yeah. Well, this is. Well, now I come to a big thing to tell you about. Do I have time? How much? I do have time. Okay, good. About that time, we got to remember this is the early days of Sputnik, and thereafter, the following year or so. The United States put up a satellite called Telstar, and there was even a nice popular song, very nice, called Telstar. I still remember it, and it was a communication satellite. In other words, you send a signal up to Telstar, and Telstar sends it back to the Earth, and you could skip right through the radius of the Earth because Telstar could see east and west a long ways. But Telstar got in trouble. because the United States did its high altitude nuclear test. Never, always the tests were on the ground or a couple thousand feet above the ground. But now the government shot a rocket way up, almost to the Van Allen belts. You remember the Van Allen belts? And they exploded an atomic bomb up there. Maybe it was a hydrogen bomb, I'm not sure, but it was surely some big bomb that put out a lot of radiation. And it formed an artificial radiation belt around the Earth. Just like the Van Allen belts, there was now a lower belt, a little bit lower, that was artificially made. And it turned out that it was the height of that belt. The height was the same as the height of Telstar's orbit. Well, Telstar got too much radiation, and it was very short-lived because of that. And then, of course, the military is always interested in these things. They said, well, these satellites, they got a big weakness. You can knock them out with radiation. I remember one of my first jobs when I got a job working in the space industry was to do a big report on how much radiation a satellite could take. They thought they'd be worried about micrometeorites, but no, it turned out radiation was the thing to worry about. So the United States got an idea what we're going to do. We're not going to have these satellites up there to repeat. We're going to put into orbit a whole bunch of needles about 2-3 inches long. These needles will be exactly the wavelength of the radio signal we're going to use, so they will act as resonant antennas. And we're going to put a belt of them around the Earth. And so the Earth would be like Saturn a bit, with artificial needles up there. Well, okay, I don't know how I guess the Russians could use the needles just as well as the Americans if they got the right wavelength. But that was the idea for military communication. Well, it turned out that if they did that, it would raise the limiting magnitude that any telescope can see by 1 magnitude because of the sky brightness. You know, if you have a big enough telescope, you can see the stars in the daytime. It's this amazing thing. But at the University of California, they would test the astronomy students, and the test was to see if you could use the setting circles or not. And they would ask you to set on the planet Jupiter in broad daylight. And if you knew how to use the circles, you could do it. So you can, with a big enough telescope, you can compensate for that brightness in the sky. But nobody wanted to see the limiting magnitude of every telescope drop by a magnitude or magnitude and a half. So along came this man I told you about, the union organizer, Edward Taylor. And he wrote a letter to the President of the United States. And I don't remember if it was Eisenhower or the president that came after Eisenhower, but he wrote a letter to the President of the United States on San Francisco Amateur Astronomers stationary letterhead and said, "Dear President, you know, for God's sakes, don't put these needles in orbit because they will knock down the limiting magnitude that we can see with all the telescopes." Well, by golly, along came Stanley Oliver, and he said, "You shouldn't use our stationary to do that. That's your personal opinion. You are interfering with the national defense." Right? Are you a communist? You were a labor organizer. So what's going on here? Anyway, they got into a big fight. There was literally a civil war developed among the amateur astronomers on the two sides there. I gotta say that Taylor did have the big majority, and Oliver was in the minority. Nonetheless, after a while, Taylor says, "What the hell?" And he left the amateur astronomers, and with him left a whole lot of other people too, who felt that he was a good man and wrongly and wrongly condemned. And Oliver became more or less the strong man of the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. And he was maybe a good mechanic, but boy, oh boy, he was not a good organizer getting meetings. It takes a certain kind of a person to do that, and he wasn't that kind of a person. And thereupon the amateur astronomers fell into bad times. It's just like reading about the history of the world, and the bad times and good times. And then after a long while, came a lady, Penny Salanave. Mr. Salanave, what's his, do anybody remember? What?
Leon.
Leon Salanave was the man. He was an astronomer. He was also an expert on lightning. And Leon Salanave is the man who set up the old Morrison Planetarium. I don't know if you know, but a lot of planetariums at that time had photographs of the sky, and they would project the photograph of the sky. Oh, the best quality photograph on the sky, and that was how the planetarium worked. But not the Morrison Planetarium. On the condensing lenses, they deposited little grains of grit, and then the bigger grains for brighter stars, and then they evaporated aluminum over the whole thing, and then brushed off the grit, and there was a hole in the aluminum wherever the stars should be, and there were great big condensing lenses taken from aircraft cameras, World War II aircraft camera. And Leon was the guy who calculated where every grit should go. And it was done with a control, an X, Y, Z microscope, and they put him down. Well, that was Leon. But again, he wasn't a super organizer either. He was an astronomer, but his wife Penny was a bit of an organizer, but for Penny Salanave coming in and running things, I think we would have evaporated. And I want to mention several times, it's an amazing thing, but it was my experience in high school and college that girls weren't too interested in science, particularly physical science. But it turns out, the facts turn out that there are various fairy godmothers that have arisen at various times to bail out the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. Penny Salanave was one of them. Of course, maybe Betty Neal was one, but another one that came after Penny Salanave, and Penny Salanave more or less said, well, if you want to have a good society, you better have a woman running it. And the woman turned out to be Mary Engle. Can we get a picture of Mary Engle?
Yeah.
And then after Mary Engle came, another woman came who also ran things. It was a fairy godmother to bail us out, and that was Edwina Cherrington, Bill Cherrington's wife, who is not with us anymore. But she was a powerful lady at her time, and she put the astronomers right. And now, by the grace of God, we have Linda Mahan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yes,
So it turns out that, I'll say one more thing about, and after Linda Mahan, after Edwina, there is Amy McManus, and she was president too for a while.
Who's here tonight?
What?
She's here tonight.
She's here tonight someplace. There she is. Can you go back to that picture of Mary Engle?
The first one or this one?
That one. Yeah. I want to point, there's Mary Engle making a 10-inch mirror. And that's her first mirror. And when I was a kid in astronomy, your first mirror was probably a 4-inch mirror, but maybe if you're a big dealer, it was a 6-inch mirror. But the idea of some girl coming along and making a first mirror that was a 10-inch mirror and finishing it with a knife test, knife edge. Incidentally, I don't think Dobson used knife edge test. It was too much. But the people that were into the Astronomical Society, they of course used the knife edge test.
Looks like a waffle.
A waffle, it is.
That's
It's
the
transparent. You're
That's
looking
the
through the transparent
Yeah.
top part of the mirror. Yeah, that was, so there's a girl making a 10-inch mirror. Well, nowadays, girls fly to the moon, but in those days, they didn't. Yeah. Okay. Well, the star parties changed a bit too. San Francisco Amateur Astronomers was never, in the olden days, big enough to have a star party by itself. And so it would always go over to Mount Diablo, where it could join the East Bay Astronomical Society and the Stockton Astronomical Society and the Davis Astronomical Society. Together they would have a pretty decent, they'd have a pretty decent star party. And I used to love it because I was in high school and I didn't have a telescope, but during the week I was kept pretty busy doing algebra. And once in a while, a month, there'd be a star party someplace and I would love to go to it. And at the star party, there are a lot of old mechanics like Oliver. And their interest, to tell you the truth, is mainly making telescopes, not so much using them.
Yeah.
And as soon as the evening came, they would set up their beautiful mechanical telescope, and then they would promptly get in their sleeping bag and go to sleep. And so would my father go to sleep. And that left the field open to my brother and I. And each of us had a 12-inch telescope all night long to play with. And that was pretty wonderful. Yeah. Later on, star parties got bigger, and the focus of the telescopes wasn't quite as good, but they began to have star parties up on Mount Diablo. And Dobson became the king of the Mount Diablo star parties. And I got to say that things changed a bit. Marijuana became more or less a regular part of the star party. I'm not criticizing it. I'm not promoting it, but I'm just saying that it did. And if you were looking at nebula, what difference did it make? It made it all the better, actually. But I think in the long run, it had the hell of an influence on scientists in general. Because back when I was in high school, the science students were very straightforward people. Once in a while, there was some kind of a bad egg in there, but they were basically very straightforward, strict people. And of course, that makes you think in a certain way. You don't have the most imagination in the world after you've worked in physics for a while, because it got to fit the equations, the dimensions got to balance, and numerically that differential equation should be plugged into the first equation and make a circle and come back. And I think that when people in science, and I'm now talking about the amateur astronomer, became exposed to marijuana, it opened up a new world to them that they could think about things that would probably be more or less unthinkable before that time.
What period of time?
what?
What years, what period of time?
I'm talking about the 1960s and 70s and 80s. I'm talking about that time. And granted that if you think like that and you get some ideas because you smoke some marijuana, most of the ideas are pretty crazy and unfocused. But here and there among all the unfocused ideas might be something, and occasionally is something. I wouldn't suggest that you should try it when you're trying to do the final on differential equations, because you better do them the old-fashioned way. But that was it. And so at those star parties have a little different feeling to them than the ones on Mount Diablo. By the way, coming back to Betty Neal again, my brother and I would run around with using those big telescopes after the mechanics went to bed, and Betty Neal noticed we didn't have coat on, so she told our father that your kids are running around without a coat at 2 o'clock in the morning up there. So after that, we had to wear a coat. I remember that. And thanks to Betty Neal, we had to wear coats. Anyway, so that was that. Well,
How about the Mount Tam Star Party? When did they start?
the Mount Tamalpais,
Yeah, when did we start having a party over there? So,
that was Dobson.
oh, was it?
No, I have a letter in my files that I came across last week that was like 1980s, mid-80s, yeah, that says it's for us setting up with the Rangers,
Yeah.
access to the gate and all that. to go up.
Was Tinka involved or not?
Yes, well,
Yes.
Tinka was doing lectures at the Mountain Theater, and then people would come to the Star Party after that. Yeah, yeah. She was great.
Okay, how long have I talked now?
Hour and 20.
An hour. Okay, well, that's getting to be enough. Now, I want to conclude with one thought. I skipped somebody I should have mentioned.
Yeah,
We-
here's somebody not to see.
Let's go and see that lady there, Nancy Cox. Speaking of head shrinkers, she's a head shrinker nurse. But that aside, the government, NASA put up the Hubble Space Telescope. And the Hubble Space Telescope had a mirror polishing error that no amateur would have ever made. And you could, they stalled at first, and they said, we're trying to figure out what's wrong. But most every amateur who had made or tested a mirror could look at the photographs and knew damn well what was wrong. Somehow it had spherical aberration, and it was a dumb mistake. And the people who realized that it was dumbest were the amateur astronomers. But NASA did a very clever move. They now said, well, the telescope's not too good, so different amateur astronomers who have good things to do can have time on the Space Telescope. Oh, well, that made it, the error not so bad. And here is, not many people got on it, not many people. You can imagine a whole United States of amateur astronomers wanting time on the Hubble telescope. This lady here, she got time. This is Nancy Cox from the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. She used to always be here, but she got time on the Space Telescope. Rah for the San Francisco Amateur Astronomers. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think an hour is enough. So I want to wind up with this thought about the influence of amateur astronomers in the world. You know, the United States, the physicists in the United States tried to build an atom smasher called the superconducting super collider. It was going to be built in Texas, underground, of course, to shield the radiation. It was going to be a ring several miles in diameter, and it was going to work wonders and eat cucumbers. And many people came around to science groups, high schools and whatnot, touting the fact that the United States should put its money into this machine. And indeed, it did start. They dug the hole for it, and they began to do it. I'm kind of proud because they had a library for the superconductor, and they bought my 2 books to be in.
Great.
Well, okay, but it got very expensive, like all those projects do. Well, every damn project in the world, doubles its budget, and eventually, Congress got fed up with it, and they cut it, and it never came. The superconducting collider never came to be to this day. But not only did they cut it, but they filled up the hole that was dug with dirt. In other words, to make it so you couldn't, to really put the kibosh on it. So there must have been people that really were anti-science, or at least anti-that science, to spend money filling up the hole. The hole in Texas is a big place. We could put a fence around it and let it be. Maybe to accumulate water. Anyway, that sort of thing could never happen in the project of going to the moon, because there were so many people not working on the project, but that knew about it and were emotionally involved, that the dream of going to the moon was now a popular, I don't know, you were to use the word myth, but it was just, there were a lot of people all over. And if they had said that the moon project is now becoming too expensive, we're not going to go there, there would have been a public revolt, because the spirit of the crowd was with going to the moon. And how did that come to be? That came to be because of the amateur astronomers. I don't mean the amateur astronomers necessarily in the 20th century, but there have been people interested in astronomy from time immemorial. That interest has been there, and the looking at the moon and this and that, and it's that made it impossible, once the moon project got started, for it to be stopped, and made it run on. I was at Redstone, Huntsville, Alabama, Redstone Arsenal. When you work for Chrysler at New Orleans, you go there fairly often. There was a big meeting, and way over, they were going to test a Saturn engine, one of the first to tests. It was a huge field, several miles away, green all the way on the lawn. There was a test stand for the engine, and they were going to test fire it. We were all out on the steps of the administration building waiting for it. It's an eerie sight, because when they test the big engine, and this was one of the first tests, you first see the flame coming out. Well, you first see the water going down on the deflector, and then you see the flame, and the steam comes up from the flame. And then, after what seems like a long time, you hear the roar. But the party's almost over by the time you hear the roar. So I was on the steps at a meeting there, and lo and behold, by the grace of God, guess who comes out and stands next to me? Wernher von Braun himself.
Oh my God.
Holy cow. And so I was a little bit intimidated to talk to him, but then I said, well, I better. It ain't going to happen again. So I said, what are you going to do? Suppose, this is one of the first test firings of the engine. Suppose the flame is not stable in the engine. Suppose something goes wrong. Suppose it explodes on the test stand. Do you ever think about that? What are you going to do if it won't go? And Wernher von Braun looked at me and he said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the paperwork, and he pointed behind him to administration. And I'm gonna stack it in that field right out there, and I'm gonna climb up on top of that pyramid of paperwork, and I'm gonna go to the moon that way. So, he could have that attitude because behind him, you know, he wasn't the first kid that wanted to go to the moon. There had been kids way back into antiquity that wanted to go to the moon. Amateur astronomers. Okay, enough. I'll shut up.
I just wanted to add that in regard to the Hubble telescope, they never once, they had this huge mirror and they didn't ever once sit it up on its side and run a beam of light down that bounced back that they cut with either a Ronchi screen or a knife edge. Never once. And so they got it up there and it didn't work. It was astonishing to all the amateur astronomers. It really was.
It also has been said that if they built that conducting superplanet, they would have maybe discovered the Higgs decades earlier.
Speak louder again.
They might have discovered the Higgs particle 10 years earlier.
Oh my gosh, really?
That's what happens when you stop research.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Jeez, amazing. Go ahead, Lou.
What got Betty Neal interested in astronomy? Do you know?
I don't know, but I can surmise that it was her father, though I was never told that. But she was in her father's arms looking at Halley's Comet. So
The first time.
that speaks for itself a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, she was in a place, you know, country kids can get interested in astronomy. City kids, it's kind of hard. But she was up in Eureka, she was a country kid.
I got one other quick question. Do you know about any of the other astronomical groups around here? Are there any sister groups that are surviving, or
Well, the East Bay Astronomical Society,
Yeah.
and I think there's a San Mateo Astronomical. What?
Livermore, too.
Liver-
All right, so there's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, now it's hot.
Yeah, there's one down by
Peninsula.
Mount Hamilton, down in the base there.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sonoma
wow.
County Astronomy.
They go up the mountains, and plus they, at that, what's the name of that? Grant Park, they do observations there.
I noticed that on your first slide, it showed AANC, and I think she must have been a member, and that's the Astronomical Association of Northern California,
Yes.
which
Yeah,
has
that's-
conferences, annual conferences, and officers, and all sorts of interesting things. But they're the overriding layer of getting to know where they are, how to get to them, and that kind of thing. AANC, and that was on her first slide.
On Betty's?
On Betty's the very first
Oh,
slide.
ANC, Amateur of the Year
AANC,
Award, yeah.
and she got Amateur of the Year award in
Grab a telescope,
1977.
you can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an umbrella group to which all the other
Everybody,
groups
they have
belonged.
annual conferences, and it was quite exciting.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Lou, this was absolutely delightful, and we thank you so very much with this certificate that I'm going to have PJ sign in just a moment because I forgot to do it.
Okay.
But thank you
Looks
so
fancy.
very much.